In the winter of 1884, as snow blanketed the streets of Berlin, inside the grand halls of Wilhelmstrasse 77, history was quietly being rewritten. Behind gilded doors, the great powers of Europe gathered, not to make peace, but to divide spoils. They weren't settling disputes over land they had cultivated or cities they had built. No, they were dividing a continent that none of them truly understood. A continent they called the Dark Continent, a continent known to them only in myths and maps, in ivory and gold, in slaves and spices, Africa. There were no African leaders present, no ambassadors from the Kingdom of Benin, no envoys from the Ashanti Empire, no voice from Ethiopia or from the mighty Zulu. Africa was not invited. Its people were not consulted. Its borders were not drawn by its children, but by foreigners with pens and power. This was the Berlin Conference. And this is the story of how a continent was stolen by ink and arrogance. To understand the Berlin Conference, we must go back to the early 19th century. Europe had long maintained coastal trading posts in Africa, especially for slaves. But by the 1800s, the transatlantic slave trade had begun to decline. Instead, European powers were hungry for resources: cotton, copper, rubber, gold, diamonds, and more. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Europe into a furnace of demand, and Africa held the fuel. In 1830, France invaded Algeria. In 1869, the Suez Canal was opened, giving Britain a strategic pathway to India and increasing its interest in Egypt. By the 1870s, explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley were mapping the interior of Africa, previously unknown to Europeans. Reports of vast rivers, fertile lands, and abundant minerals reached the royal courts of Europe, and the greed followed quickly. Most ambitious of all was King Leopold II of Belgium, a monarch with a tiny country but enormous imperial dreams. Through cunning and deception, he hired Stanley to claim vast territories in the Congo on his behalf. He branded it a humanitarian mission, meant to civilize and uplift the natives. In truth, it was a private colonial enterprise built on exploitation and violence. But as each power rushed to claim pieces of Africa, tensions grew. Conflicts loomed between Britain and France, France and Germany, Portugal and Belgium. Africa was becoming a battlefield, not for Africans, but for Europeans. Something had to be done. A system had to be put in place. And so the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who had no colonies himself but sought to maintain European balance, offered to host a conference. On November 15, 1884, representatives from 14 countries gathered in Berlin: Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Austria, Hungary, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, the United States. Their goal: to agree on the rules of colonization, not to end colonization, not to liberate peoples, but to organize it, to make empire more civilized. Bismarck opened the conference with the illusion of neutrality, claiming that Germany had no selfish interest in Africa. But this was a lie. Bismarck saw in the conference a way to increase Germany's influence, to play mediator between Britain and France, and to advance German trade. But the real power brokers in the room were Britain, France, and Belgium. France wanted a stretch of territory from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Britain envisioned a railroad from Cairo to Cape Town. And Leopold, he wanted the Congo, all of it. There were no maps of tribal lands, no consultations with local rulers. Instead, maps were redrawn over wine and cigars with rulers, lines, and dreams of empire. The General Act of Berlin. On February 26, 1885, after more than 3 months of meetings, the conference concluded with the signing of the General Act of the Berlin Conference. It established key principles. 1. Notification of territorial claims. Any European power claiming new African land had to inform the others. 2. Effective occupation. A claim was only legitimate if the power actually controlled the territory with troops, administration, or infrastructure. 3. Free trade zones. The Congo Basin and Niger River were declared free for commerce by all. 4. Suppression of the slave trade. While noble in appearance, this was often used to justify invasion and control, but most importantly, it formalized the scramble for Africa. It turned exploration into conquest. It made theft legal and division systematic. No African leaders signed the document. No tribes were acknowledged. No history was considered. Only the interests of Europe mattered. The scramble accelerates with the rules now established. The race was on. France surged into West Africa, seizing vast territories from Senegal to Chad. Britain expanded south and east, taking control of Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, and finally claiming dominance in South Africa. Germany, a newcomer to the colonial game, snatched Cameroon, Togo, Tanzania, and Namibia. Portugal, despite its declining power, clung to Angola and Mozambique. Italy took parts of the Horn of Africa. By 1900, just 15 years after the conference, 90% of Africa was under European control. The only exceptions were Liberia, a country founded by freed American slaves, and Ethiopia, which successfully defended itself under Emperor Menelik II at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, defeating Italian invaders. But nowhere was colonization more brutal than in the Congo Free State, ruled not by a government, but by one man, King Leopold II. The Congo, a kingdom of terror. Leopold's Congo was not a colony, it was his private possession. His agents forced the population to gather wild rubber, whips and guns enforced quotas, villages were burned, families were torn apart, children were taken as hostages to ensure compliance. Men who failed to meet their rubber quotas had their hands chopped off. Entire tribes vanished. It's estimated that 10 million people died under Leopold's reign of terror. Eventually, the atrocities became too horrifying to ignore. Missionaries, journalists, and whistleblowers exposed the horrors. International pressure forced Leopold to hand the territory over to the Belgian state in 1908. But the damage was done. The pattern had been set. Africa's resources, people, and dignity were forfeit, sacrificed at the altar of European greed. Resistance and rebellion. Yet Africa was never silent. From the earliest invasions, resistance flared. In Sudan, the Mahdi led a revolt that defeated British-Egyptian forces at Khartoum. In Algeria, Abd al-Qadir resisted French domination for years. In South Africa, the Zulu kingdom under Shaka and later Cetshwayo fought fierce wars. In Zimbabwe, Lobengula resisted British incursions. In Ghana, the Ashanti launched multiple wars to preserve their sovereignty. Sometimes they won, more often they lost. But the flame of independence never died. The weapons of resistance evolved, from spears to rifles, from battlefields to schools, from kingdoms to movements. Colonialism bred nationalism. Oppression sowed the seeds of revolt. The borders drawn in Berlin. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Berlin Conference was its map, or rather, its impact on future maps. The borders drawn during and after the conference were arbitrary, ignoring ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and geographic realities. One tribe might be split between three countries, rival ethnic groups forced into one. Mountains, rivers, and deserts disregarded. What mattered were resources and rivalries, not people. These borders would later fuel civil wars, genocides, and separatist movements. Rwanda, Nigeria, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Their troubles can be traced, in part, to lines drawn in Berlin. The myth of civilization. European powers claimed they were bringing civilization. Railroads, schools, medicine, Christianity. But these were tools of control, not liberation. African traditions, languages, and religions were suppressed. European names replaced local ones. Native education was limited. Resources were exported, wealth drained, people enslaved. Again, but this time as workers in their own lands. Africa was not developed, it was exploited. And when independence came, mostly after World War II, it came with scars. Economies still dependent on exports, governments built on colonial frameworks, military regimes, corruption, and instability, fueled by the vacuum left by sudden withdrawal. Legacy of the Berlin Conference. What began in Berlin in 1884 did not end in 1885. Its consequences ripple through time. Colonialism changed the trajectory of African history. Borders imposed by outsiders became battle lines. Cultures were erased, languages lost, identities fragmented. Mistrust between tribes, between nations, between Africa and the West was born. But so was resistance, so was resilience. Africa has not only survived, it is rising. Nations like Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, and Ethiopia are shaping the 21st century. African voices are no longer silent. African thinkers, artists, scientists, and leaders are reclaiming their story. The Berlin Conference was not a diplomatic achievement. It was a crime, a theft carried out not with guns, but with ink and arrogance. It was colonialism with a handshake and champagne. But history remembers. And though the map of Africa still bears the marks of that winter in Berlin, the people of Africa are redrawing their own futures, this time in their own words. Because Africa was never the dark continent. It was only obscured by the shadows of empire. Now the light is returning,